Story 1. I'll preface this by saying we were 12 to 13 at the time, and my friend and I often snuck out of either of our houses during sleepovers for late-night walks. This was the basis of this terrifying encounter, and it stopped us from ever sneaking out after dark again. My friend lived opposite a huge forest, so her house was the preferred choice to sneak out for us to roam around at night, and we always took flashlights, food, and blankets so we could camp out for a couple of hours before going back home again. Well, on this fateful night, we inadvertently fell asleep instead of staying awake, so when my friend suddenly jolted me from sleep, it was past 3 a.m. A lot later than we usually snuck out. We grabbed our essentials and creeped out of the back door into the cold and dark night. Frost crunched underfoot as we crossed the deserted road, and as we reached the entrance to the forest we noticed how pitch black and completely silent it was, unnervingly so. We turned down our torches and stepped onto the uneven path into the forest, the light illuminating the trees swaying in the icy wind. We stepped on fallen sudden leaves and bark as we made an unsteady but familiar way into our favorite part of the forest, our called breath, the only noise to invade the deafening silence. We reached the small hut we constructed one afternoon, made entirely of sticks, purely for the purposes of having some shelter for our campouts. There were times that vandals or other kids damaged our hut, but for the most part it stayed intact. But on this occasion it was completely destroyed, like a harbinger of worse to come. We were deciding just to call it a night and come back later on that day to repair the hut when we heard this loud shrieking giggle that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My friend and I jumped in shock and looked at each other like, what the? We were completely freaked out. The eerie and unnatural giggle rang out again, contradicting the silence and making my body break out in goosebumps. Someone is in here, my friend whispered to me, looking utterly terrified. We have to go now. Voice of rationale made it even more scary and unnerving to me that someone was in the forest with us at 3 o'clock in the morning. We just looked at each other in assent and took off running in unison, our footsteps navigating the path as naturally as we could from muscle memory or uneven gasps of air punctuating the giggling that seemed to be following us, getting closer and closer. Our torches' light went up and down with our fast movements, illuminating random patches of the trees and bushes as we finally saw a small sliver of light as we came to the forest entrance. Running out of the forest, we didn't stop until we reached the back door of my friend's house and almost collapsed in a breathless heap of relief to be safe. Then my friend's eyes went wide and she nudged me, pointing a shaky finger across the road. A haggard woman of indeterminate age was standing at the forest entrance, giggling that awful, horrifying giggle, and was waving over at us. We screamed and ran inside and looked out of my friend's bedroom window through the smallest gap in the curtain, and we could still see the woman standing there. Worse yet, she was staring right at us as if she knew we were there. We could tell she was still giggling that hideous, appalling laugh. She turned very slowly and walked back into the forest again. We never went back to that forest, nor went out after dark again. This happened to me when I was a teenager. I think it was the spring of 1998 when I was 14. My Boy Scout troop went hiking in the Ozark Mountains in Arkansas. I grew up in a very small town in Tennessee, and the boys in my troop, Story 2, were people I'd known my whole life, and we were all very close and knew each other very well and trusted each other. We'd been hiking for 5 days or so, and it was miserable. It rained every day, and we were all exhausted and sore and hungry and covered with blisters. The adults realized we'd bitten off more than we could chew in trying to hike a 60-mile trail, especially with the awful weather, so we changed course and gotten off the trail to spend a night in a drive-in campground. It was in a very remote area, far from a town or house. There may have been a few other small groups there, but if there were, we never interacted with them or saw any of them. We were all filthy and wet, and thus very excited about taking a hot shower. It was dark, and we'd finished dinner. A group of 5 of my friends, including my friend Jeremy, headed up to the bathhouse, which was maybe a quarter-mile walk through the pitch-dark woods and upper worn-down gravel walking trail. I stayed behind to clean up, and after 10 or 15 minutes followed them by myself. I had a weak little flashlight. I remember the woods were totally silent. When I got about halfway to the bathhouse, I heard a noise to my left, and I looked over and saw my friend Jeremy standing by an old-school manual water pump about 20 feet off of the trail. It was a strange light around him, like the moon had come out from behind the clouds. I was startled to see him there. by himself and the woods off the trail, I asked him if he was already done with his shower. He seemed kind of sad, and he said, "Yeah, and it's all yours." And I said, "Okay." I didn't think much of it until I got to the bathhouse. When I walked in through the door, my friends were all in there, and I heard Jeremy talking from in the shower all. The blood drained out of my head, and all the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I had to sit down before I passed out. My friends were freaked out and wanted to know what was wrong. I told them what had happened. They nervously made jokes about how I must have been smoking pot, but I could tell they believed me. Like I said, we'd known each other forever and knew when one of us was exaggerating or playing a joke. We all waited together until everyone finished showering and brushing teeth and whatnot, and then walked back together in total silence. When we got to the spot, I'd seen whoever. He was gone without a trace. The water pump was there though. No one had noticed it before because it was a ways off the trail and obviously not in use. We got back to our campsite and went to bed freaked out. I remember not sleeping much that night, and all the years since then I've never been able to figure out what happened. Was there a random teenage boy in the woods who looked just like my friend? Unlikely. Did I hallucinate it? Also unlikely. Who's to say? Story 3. My friend from college told me a harrowing story that happened to her and her friends in high school. She's from Buffalo, New York, and often went on camping trips to local upstate campgrounds. When she was a senior, her and 4 of her friends went to a campsite fitted with rows of cabins on the water that people could rent as the sun went down. The girls noticed that their neighbors a few cabins down were playing music and grooving around the campfire drinking beers. One of the guys asked them all if they wanted to join. When they got over there and started hanging with the guys, everything seemed completely normal and they were having a fun time. As the night progressed, one of the guys started to get blackout drunk and eventually pulled out a revolver that he sent belonged to his dad. He started waving it around and playing with it. This obviously freaked everyone out, his own friends included. Eventually he started pointing the gun to his head and laughing while his friends were yelling at him to put it away and how that wasn't funny. The girls at this point were fairly disturbed and told the guys that they should get back to their cabin and set their goodbyes. When they got back to the cabin, they all talked about how freaky that was and expressed concern for the drunk guy. They then moved on to other topics of conversation and forgot about it for the time being, and a few hours later, sometime in the middle of the night, they heard a loud bang coming from the direction of their neighbor's cabin. Shortly after this, her brigade of cop car showed up to the scene. An officer went to my friend's cabin and started asking them questions about the cabin they visited earlier that night. When my friend asked the officer what happened, he explained that the kid had shot himself in the head in front of his friends. They weren't able to discern if he'd done it purposely or it was an accident. My friend to this day still has PTSD over this incident and explained that she rarely goes camping anymore. Story 4. My parents got divorced when I was 12, and my mom moved us into a small town in the Pennsylvania mountains. After a few months of living there, I went back to live with my dad in Texas. Ever since then, though, I have heard these voices of people I know calling me into the woods. It's been almost 8 years now. It's only when I'm alone, but not every time I'm alone, and it seems to only happen in Texas. It's weird, but I never even considered this was maybe something to be concerned about until recently. It was just something that happened. I even followed the voice once and only thought it was kind of weird that I had heard my dad screaming for me if he didn't actually call me, because I got home later and asked him about it. I don't know if this is related or not, but remembering it is what sparked this post. A few years ago, I was about a mile out in the woods in Pennsylvania when I zoned out for a minute. When I zoned back in, I heard a stick snap and looked over to see a white-tailed doe staring at me from about 10-ish feet away. It looked almost as if it had been trying to sneak closer to me. When I looked at it, I just sort of backed away from it and went back down the mountain. I'm not entirely sure what to make of this now that I'm looking back on all the times. I just sort of brushed it off as normal. Story 5. This was about 4 or 5-ish years ago. Back then I lived with my mother in a shed on a farm surrounded by woodland. Our farmland was part of a larger piece of farmland that was split up and sold off, so we did have neighbors, although they were roughly half a kilometer away each. We loved that because of the privacy. It wasn't like there was nobody nearby I couldn't go to if I needed help. That thought is what had me fearlessly walking alone at night between the hours of 7 to 8 p.m., sometimes fluctuating from Earlier to later depending on the day. Sometimes I even went out on a walk at 2 a.m. in the morning because I was restless and couldn't sleep. Looking back, this was incredibly stupid, and after this incident I never walked after 6 p.m. ever again, always making sure there was at least some sunlight when I set out. The route I always took was a road circuit. The first part was out in the open in front of all the other farms, including my own. If anything had happened, at least one person would have noticed, and reception was pretty good, so I would also have been able to call someone. The second half, on the other hand, was concealed by about 200 meters of woods between the farms and the back road, stretching the full 2 kilometers at the back of the farm, and it was during that part of the walk when I had this creepy encounter. It was late at night, I can't remember what time exactly, but it was pitch black with the exception of my torchlight. I was about to approach the turn in the loop that would bring me out into the open again when I heard it. How it was this monotone voice that repeatedly asked for help. It didn't seem panicked in the least. I took my earphones out and turned my music off to make sure I was hearing correctly, but it didn't stop. How very stupid part of me almost responded, because for some reason my first instinct was I don't know, someone's in trouble, like a naive kid, even though I would have been like 16 or 17 at the time. And of course then my brain kicked in and I realized that approaching that voice was just about the stupidest thing I could do, so I started quietly backing away. Unfortunately, my cat had followed me on the walk and wasn't backing away with me. No, she was walking towards the voice, softly hissing. I remember desperately trying to get her to come back towards me without alerting the voice to my presence, just in case they hadn't noticed me yet, but I was getting scared and didn't want to stay there a moment more. So I run towards my cat and grabbed her, and I then turned around and bolted back towards my house. I don't know if it was stupid of me to turn my back to the voice, as I was making so much noise while running that there was no way they didn't know I was there, and I had no way of knowing if they were giving chase. I was so terrified the whole time. The image of someone cloaked in the shadows chasing me entered my mind, and even though I couldn't hear anyone behind me, I never once slowed down until I was back safe and sound within my house. And it doesn't end there, though. Despite how terrifying it was, there was still a part of me that was concerned about whoever it was, because what if they really had needed help? So I asked my mother to drive us to the location, another very stupid decision considering what we found. That being nothing, we called out and called out, but nobody answered. We didn't get out of the car, though luckily neither of us were that stupid. We drove home having seen nothing and no one, but it still bothered me in the morning, so I had my mother drive us over again, and we searched the immediate area. Nothing, no indication that anyone had been there. Was no body, which admittedly was a drastic thing to search for, but I know shock can leave you eerily calm, which could have explained the monotone voice and lack of response afterwards. It made me fear that we'd been too late and that we'd find a body in the morning. I don't know if I would have preferred this outcome, because at least I would have had a face to the voice, but no, we found absolutely nothing, and to this day I have no idea who that voice belonged to and why they were monotonously calling out for help. My mind is naturally come to some chilling conclusions and theories that leave me unable to sleep at night. Maybe a kidnapper, serial killer, all the classic horror stories, but I guess I'll never really know for sure. Story 6. Okay, so this happened when I was 17. My now fiancé and I lived in the mountains and used to smoke up green often. At this point, we decided to go up our favorite parkway to smoke a bit. The parkway was a long road of a mountain with more pull-offs to look either at more mountains or down at the city. We went to our favorite Polo, which is about 25 minutes up the mountain. We smoked and hung out for a while. Unfortunately, we didn't realize how fast it was getting dark and the cold front was moving in. At that moment in time, I felt confident that I was sober enough to be able to drive without a problem, so we started heading our way down. Long story short, I found out real fast that I was overconfident and was still too high for this drive, so I asked my fiancé if I could stop at a pull-off and sober up a bit more, which he was perfectly fine with. So this is where the story starts. I pull off at the next one I sing, and a car is already parked. We park about 15 feet away, and it happened so fast, and I couldn't even get a full breath in. My fiancé says, "What are they doing?" And when I look over, the guy in the car looks like he's on top of someone. My fiancé said there was a girl in the car as well that I didn't see. The guy was in the passenger seat. What was really weird is that it honestly Looked like he was choking the girl, but we couldn't tell. I mean, no judgment, maybe it was something they were into, but our high minds were like that, and I told my fiancée I was gonna start driving, but it was going to be slow, so just bear with me again. Unfortunately, life always has other plans. The pull-off we went into had one exactly across on the other side of the road where we didn't see a black truck sitting there. Well, right when I was about to pull out, the truck was weirdly already waiting to pull out with his headlights off, and right when I pull out onto the road, he turns his lights on and is immediately on my bumper. At this point, I'm high as freaking out trying to just get down the mountain. Anyways, he followed me all the way down. Not even backing up a bit, I get onto the highway, and this truck is pulling in front of us trying to get us to slow down, and the person keeps flickering their turn signals back and forth to get me to pull over. That happened for about 2 minutes before my fiancé says slow down to 10 miles per hour, which is dangerous on a road like that. He had his own reason why he thought it was a good idea, I just don't remember. But once I did, the truck quickly sped away really fast. It didn't make any sense, and we now think there's a chance people could have been messing with us. I have no idea if us seeing a guy choking someone and then being followed were related, but it was weird. I definitely don't smoke and drive anymore. Story 7. So this is a story my dad recently told me about my grandpa and his father. My grandpa grew up in very rural southern Indiana but moved to very rural southern Illinois in its youth. So this takes place in Illinois. One night my grandpa and his dad were hanging out at his uncle's, who lived a couple of miles away. Keep in mind, this is the 40s out in the country, so all roads are just dirt basically. Anyway, it was pretty late, so they decided to head home, and they hopped into one of their old cars. They were going about 15 miles per hour through the wooded roads. At some point, as they're just driving and talking, they passed something along the edge of the road standing upright. They both hunted and were very familiar with any animals or other local people that may be around. Neither one of them really said anything for a minute, and they both looked at each other and said, "What the hell was that?" My grandpa asked his dad, "Do you want to turn around?" And his dad said no. And they kept on driving. My grandpa said it resembled a big owl or a small person just standing in the ditch. Story 8. This happened to me a while back when I decided to go on a camping trip alone. I always liked camping alone. There's something serene and sobering about being isolated in the middle of the wilderness, and I always found it relaxing. So I planned out what trail I was going to take, packed my camping gear and my rifle for protection, and jumped into my truck. I get to this trail early in the morning and hike about 15 to 20 miles in until I find the right spot and head off the trail to find a place to put my tent up. I stumble upon a nice-sized clearing and decide that it's a nice, beautiful spot to settle down. I'm exhausted at this point, but set up the tent to the southernmost edge of the clearing next to the tree line and manage to get a fire going. I roast some weenies and start to hear a sound in the distance underneath all the forest noise. It sounds like an animal, most likely a deer with a lame leg, as it sounded like the animal was making a walking, dragging noise. I feel bad for the poor guy, but it was too far away and it was getting dark, so I couldn't really go and put it out of its misery. I think nothing of it after that and go about eating my food. After I eat, I douse the fire and crawl into my tent and insert myself into my sleeping bag. I decide that even at my exhausted and relaxed state, I can't go to sleep, so I pull out a book I brought with me and start to read. By the light of my lamp, hours go by, and I hear that sound again, this time closer, right at the opposite side of the clearing. Surprised, I put my book down and listen to this animal walk, drag across the clearing towards my tent. It's really loud at this point, and it sounds like the hooves are being heavily planted, with the dragging noise following seconds after, like the deer is dragging something along. It makes it to about what I assume is the middle of the clearing. That stops, and I hear nothing, no breathing, I mean not a sound from this animal. I unzip the tent and look into the clearing. Nothing but trees and darkness. What the hell? Unnerved at this point, I zip the tent back up and sit there listening for other noises. Nothing, just crickets in the breeze. I decide that there are a lot of strange noises in the woods and tried not to let it bother me. Besides, I have my rifle. I started those off when I hear men's laughter off in the distance to my right. Then woman's laughter and sticks snapping far off to my left. I'm up now wondering if what I'm hearing is really what I'm hearing or just a product of being half asleep. I hear more faint laughing from a couple of other different directions, all different-eyed men, old women even. children and confirm that it's real. The noises are closing in, and I grab my rifle, preparing to fire a warning shot off in the air in case they came too close. Something about this laughter, how far in I was, the noise earlier, and the time of night told me that this was not just another family strolling through. I was on edge already, but then I noticed the nightlife was dead quiet. Not even the wind was making any noise. I decided enough was enough. I unzipped the tent and fired a shot into the night. I sat there and surveyed the tree line. Saw nothing, listened intensely to my surroundings. No laughing, and the forest sounds had returned, relaxing just a bit, and figuring that scared whoever off, I sat down, and in my exhausted state I fell asleep. I wake up in a cold sweat, wrapped with anxiety, and it was still dark outside. I immediately hear two people whispering not too far from my tent. Alert, grab my rifle, and listen to what they're saying. I can't make out much, but I hear something about being lost, so I shout, "Hey, who's there?" The voices fall silent. I shout again, "Are you guys lost? Who's there?" Suddenly a huge burst of flame, like a flamethrower, erupted from the middle of the clearing, illuminating several silhouettes of people just standing around in shock. I fire my rifle, blowing a hole in the front of my tent, and it goes dark. Without checking my surroundings, I get up and sprint out of my tent, making a hard left back to where the trail was. I hiked until sunrise back to my truck with my head over my shoulder the entire way. Never heard anyone follow me, never saw anyone or anything the whole way, but couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. After that, my enjoyment of camping alone left me, like I left all my gear in the woods that night. Story 9. I feel I should preface this story with a statement that I'm usually a skeptic when it comes to paranormal stories. Albeit an open-minded one, I'd never had an experience I would truly say was paranormal until this one. I've searched for hours on Google, attempting to find a similar story from someone else, and have had no luck. What really stands out for me is that there's an energy or feeling that accompanies the experience, and even remembering it still gives me this feeling and goosebumps. This is not something I normally experience, and most people that know me would probably be surprised that I would be spooked by much of anything. I am a veteran, and I've spent years since leaving the military working in emergency rooms, specialized security, and doing other high adrenaline jobs, and I am not prone to being creeped out. I'm hoping to find someone else who may have had a similar experience as I. Feel oddly compelled to relate to someone about this. With that, here goes. A couple of months ago, I was driving with my wife down a rural highway in Oregon, returning home from a road trip to Crater Lake. We live on the coast, and the highway we were taking to get back is very curvy as it winds through the Cascade Mountain Range. It was dark as ink, and probably about 11 p.m. we were driving along, and I was just watching the road, going about 45 miles per hour. We rounded band, which makes me slow down to about 45, and just as we get around it, my wife suddenly says, "Look out, there's a person there." It takes me a second for some reason as I let off the gas, then I noticed it crouched near the side of this two-lane highway on my left side, as a person wearing what looks like gray baggy sweats or clothes and a reflective vest. This is an easy 20 miles either direction for civilization, and is heavily wooded. Think Oregon coast forest. I begin braking, and instantly the figure stands up, faces us, and begins jogging directly to the car. It felt like electricity in the air is when she faced us. Her head was flopped to the side, like her neck was totally limp, and her mouth was wide open. She appeared to have gray hair, and her arms and hands were held up to her chest. Her wrists curled, her legs didn't seem to be working right either as she hobbled at us. Think like severe progressed MS. Then it hacked, this primal-like feeling of dread, like my subconscious knew something wasn't right. I couldn't fully focus on her as the car was still moving, and I had to steer, but my wife was looking right at her. My first thought normally would have been to hit the brakes and see what was going on, as once again, this is literally miles and miles from town. But it was just this dread feeling in the air, and time almost seemed to slow down at that moment. I hear my wife say, "Don't stop, just go." Instinctively, I accelerated as we sped up. This lady was jogging right at us, and must have come within a foot of running into the side of our car as we went past her. We rounded the next band, and I looked at my wife and just said, "What the hell was that? I should turn around. Who the hell jogs out here?" What was wrong with her neck? My wife just looks at me and says, "No, don't go back. I don't know what that was." I told her I couldn't look directly at her for long as I was focused on the road, but I described what I saw, and she Confirmed she saw the same. She said when she came up to the side of the car, she was staring right at us, and my wife looked into her eyes, but she didn't have any pupils, and her expression was frozen with her mouth open. We scoured news stories, and I even contacted authorities. They advised no one was reported missing or heard out. There I still get this strange, intense, electrified feeling any time I think about her, as does my wife. Any time I talk about her, I'm compelled to refer to the person as it. All I know is it wasn't right. We have now coined her the floppy-headed jogger. Has anyone else experienced something like this? Story 10. A few years ago, I was a university student in Eastern Washington, but dating a girl in Western Washington. I was visiting her for the weekend during the summer when we got into a huge fight at around midnight, and I left. Deciding to head back to my apartment, I mentioned this for context as to why I was driving through Snoqualmie Pass after 1 in the morning. I never gone through this pass so late before, and what is usually a very busy stretch of freeway on I-90 was completely empty. I went well over an hour without seeing a single vehicle going either way, so naturally I was driving way too fast. At the time I had a 73 Chevy Nova. It wasn't quite the classic, but it had power and the complete lack of AC. Even though it was late at night, the combination of a warm summer night and the large amount of heat that bleeds through from the engine meant that I had my windows down and was sweating. Not far into the east side of the mountains around 1:30. I had a long stretch of straight road that doesn't have an on-ramp or any way to get into the freeway when suddenly a set of headlights appeared behind me, something like 200 feet back. I glanced back at the lights, puzzled as to where the vehicle could have possibly come from. I noticed that despite the fact that I was absolutely hauling, the lights were gaining on me. I decided to switch lanes and slow down a bit so it could pass. After a moment, the vehicle, now only half that distance, moved over behind me into the same lane. This is when I began to panic. I'm in the middle of nowhere, hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour, and now I've got some aggressive drunk running up on me. I watched as those lights got closer, 60 feet, 50 feet, 40 feet. In seconds it was upon me. I braced against the steering wheel, expecting to get rear-ended by a vehicle going much faster than me. Now I watched in my rear-view mirror in horror as those headlights blasted right into the back of my vehicle, and suddenly everything froze. Quite literally nothing physical hit me, but the whole vehicle frosted over and I could see my breath. I hit the brakes and did my best to pull over despite not being able to see through the windshield. Every hair on my body was standing on end. I got out of my vehicle and paced back and forth, examining my car, which was already starting to defrost as streams of water poured down it. There was no damage to my back bumper, and absolutely no sign of whatever vehicle had hit me. Eventually I calmed down enough to get back in the car and drive the rest of the way back, wake my roommates, and explain what had just happened. The next time I drove through that area in the daylight, right about where I think the ghost card hit me, there was a very old wooden cross, somewhat overgrown, on the side of the road. Story 11. I hope this isn't too vague a question. A couple of years ago, I did a bicycle tour from Eugene, Oregon to Lagunitas, California, just north of San Francisco. To save money, I typically would drag my rig into the woods of a nearby national forest and do dispersed camping for free. I was in a shoestring budget, to say the least. If you know the basic geography of that part of Oregon, you know I had to bike west from Eugene through the coastal range and meet the Pacific coast, which I would then follow to my final destination. However, once I reached the coast, in order to keep finding free camping, I would eventually have to venture inland into the woods, most nights, sometimes as far as 15 miles. Now I've spent a significant amount of times outdoors in remote areas out west and in the upper Midwest where I was raised. I'm familiar with the sometimes eerie silence the woods can take on when you're truly in the middle of nowhere, or the heightened vigilance that setting brings on. However, I had never before felt an oppressive, dark, dreadful energy in my environment like I did alone in the woods of southwest Oregon. The feeling of wrongness was a common occurrence when I stopped somewhere to evaluate a campsite. I often felt a strong sense of claustrophobia in those words, and often felt that I was not alone. A strong sense of paranoia became a nightly feature on that leg of the trip, and my sleep schedule suffered considerably. Keep in mind, I was stone cold sober on this tour. Somehow I powered on, and I never saw any sort of creature or entity, but I still can't shake the feeling that there's something evil in those forests. Once again, I emphasize that I'm well Traveled in the U.S., experienced in the outdoors, and have never once felt that way anywhere else I have been. Story 12. Years ago I moved from a very small town to a remote valley out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by national forest and not many neighbors. It was just what I had always wanted at that point in my life. I'd been a paramedic for about 4 or 5 years, and being an outdoorsy, civic-minded sort, I decided to volunteer my services with a local search and rescue organization. For being such a tiny, poorly funded organization, we were surprisingly busy. In the 9 years I was with them, we'd have at least one rescue every weekend. Spring through fall, the source of the majority of these calls was the roughly 100 miles of poorly maintained fire trails that were very popular with dirt bike and quad riders. When they'd inevitably get lost or wreck and get injured, we'd head out, track them down, provide medical care, and fly them out on a helicopter or put them on a Stokes basket mounted to a janky-ass trailer thing we'd pull with a quad. About 2 weeks after joining and zero training beyond what I'd learned as a Boy Scout and medic, I got my first call. A group of dirt bikers from the city had lost a member of their party. For some reason, they'd put their least experienced rider at the back of the group of a dozen or so riders and took off into the woods. When they returned to the trailhead 4 hours later, the inexperienced guy was missing. They set out again and looked for him for 4 or 5 hours. Then they gave up and called 911. The time interval from the initial 911 call until we had a squad assembled at the trailhead was pretty impressive. No more than 20 minutes, but we were already 8 or 9 hours behind the ball. We did a very quick briefing, distributed maps, divided into teams, then set off. They put me on a squad with the most experienced guy, and we had it out. The plan was for each 2 to 3 person team to take one of the longer trails that ring the place. Then after searching those, we'd systematically work our way into the shorter maze-like trails that made up the interior. This was to be a hasty search, none of that grid search, just riding around looking for clues. I don't know what I had expected exactly. Maybe a few dirt roads through the woods or something, but these trails were an absolute nightmare. They were extremely rugged, technical trails where you really had to know what you were doing and where you were going, or you'd never make it out. GPS rarely worked due to the rugged terrain, and tray cover radios and cell phones were a shoot, and the maps didn't account for all the random trails. Riders would just sort of make. The only marked roads were fire breaks, and mileage-wise those accounted for maybe 10 of the trails. Why this guy hadn't been partnered with someone or put in the front of the group is a mystery. 4 hours into this, I'm caked with mud, bleeding from being hit with branches, exhausted and just done. We take a water break and hear broken radio traffic that sounds like a bike has been found, but no rider. It's only a couple of miles from us, so we head that direction. When we get there, the bike is off to the side of the road along with the quartz of the other teams, but we can see them a few hundred feet in the woods. We walk over and find them looking down at the missing person, who is very dead, lips blue, skin dusky. Oh, I'm spread out like a cross. On first glance, his eyes look to be wide open and solid white, but when I examined them, I could see that his eyes were actually covered with fly eggs. The guy had been dead for a while. It didn't make much sense though. His bike still had gas in it, he had water and food, and he was a healthy guy in his late 20s. Why was he dead? It looked like he'd simply laid his bike down, then ran into the woods to die. Mission accomplished. I guess we wrapped him in blankets, then put him on the Stokes and took him to the trailhead where a coroner was waiting. About a week later, I ran into the corner and asked what the cause of death had been. The pathologist's determination was cardiac dysthymia second to extreme anxiety. The guy literally died of fright, which up until that point I had always assumed was Hollywood. I've always wondered what was going through his head. Was he just afraid of the words or being lost? If so, why did he run blindly into the woods instead of continuing to follow the trail? There's a part of me that thinks he may have seen something out there. I've heard a lot of stories about weird in these words, and I've seen a few strange things myself, so it wouldn't surprise me. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed that. If you have a scary story you would like me to read in an upcoming video, this is one way to help me guarantee variety in the stories I share. You can email me or post it to my subreddit. I'll drop the details in the video description. Thank you all for listening, and a special thanks to my patrons and channel members who now have early access to ad-free videos as well as other behind-the-scenes content. Thank you to Fox, Mulder, Ram, Beltran, Tina, Nick, Bigdowski, Sarah, CH, Neil, Kavanaugh, Tierra Sanders, Timothy Stratton, Jennifer Jenkins, Lloyd Rash, Maribel DeLuna, Michael O'Malley. Marissa Coro, Amber Hops, King Slim, Justin Beast, Gillespie, Joy, Dana J. Bartle, Anissa, Stephanie, McLaren, Luminakami. Skin Crawler, Adi Arabella, plays 2006, Michelle Welchman, Dana B. Lisa McDonald. Clary Scott, Madison C. Wasp, Sting, Jennifer J. Ashley, Lily, Pad, Lee, Taya, Wyatt, Gina. Laura, JK06, Fenrizio, Donna, Joey, Big, GSC, Tanya, Spaghetti, Willow King. Matthew, October, Gypsy, Lisa, Ollie Thomas. Build With Me, Letitia, Fran Dabs. Insomnicats, Stephanie Summer, Rebecca Tyra, This Bad Kitty, Your Pappy's Dilly. Laney, Tripping Balls, Through History, Samantha, Erica, Alyssa. Tracy, Killian's Place, April, James, Arterberg. Jan Joy, Handout, Pegasus, Genesis. Karen, Key2 V, Barry, LJ, Fiona, X Fox. I Like Booty, Monica, Level, Ace Chris, and Donna, Holly, Spry. Kimber, Jasmine, Cyanotics, Heather, Haven, Kitty Cat, Luna. 2 ADHD, Aurora, Janice, Cinderella Baby. Borderline, Betty, Lady, Draco, Erica, Nicole, Snowball, Ruthina, Melanie, The Honeybee 987. Pretty Girl 215, Ryan Brooke, Wendy, Crafty Cow. Tina, Dina, Vampy, Debs, Patricia, Amber, Krista, Brenda. Absent, Alice, Christy King, Spider's Web. Ooh La La, Andrea, Sumonique, Sean Gorman, Emma, Lisa Sigma. Cubax, Greg, Chelsea, Amanda Jang. San Tappy, Sarah C., Austin Tegan, Lil Smart. Jenny Gabrielle 505, Sarah Pink, James Gargano, Gemma Allo. Monica Level Ace, and Alex. I hope you're doing well, guys. I'll see you all on next one.